The acrid smell of burning rubber mixed with gasoline hit Jake Morrison's nostrils before he even saw the plume of black smoke rising from the highway ahead. His hands tightened on the steering wheel of his old pickup truck as he accelerated toward the scene, every instinct screaming that someone needed help. What he didn't know was that the next 60 seconds would change his life forever, and that a simple act of courage would set in motion events that would leave his modest Nebraska farm covered in helicopters by sunrise. Jake was the kind of man who fixed things. Engines, tractors, relationships between stubborn neighbors, it didn't matter. At 53, his hands were calloused from 30 years of working in his garage on the outskirts of Millbrook, a town so small that everyone knew everyone else's business before breakfast. He'd never married, never had children of his own, and lived alone in the farmhouse his parents had left him. Most folks would call his life simple. Some might even call it lonely. But Jake had learned long ago that a man's worth wasn't measured by what he owned or who stood beside him, it was measured by what he did when it mattered most. The overturned SUV was barely visible through the flames when Jake skidded to a stop on the shoulder. His heart hammered against his ribs as he grabbed the fire extinguisher from behind his seat, a habit from years of working with volatile engines, and sprinted toward the wreckage. The heat hit him like a physical wall, and for a split second, fear nearly froze him in place. Then he heard it, the high-pitched screaming of children. "Help! Please, someone help my babies!" A woman was trapped in the driver's seat, her face bloodied and twisted in agony. But it was the car seats in the back that made Jake's blood run cold. Two little girls, couldn't have been more than 4 years old, their identical faces streaked with tears as flames began creeping through the crushed rear of the vehicle. The doors were jammed, the windows too small, and the fire was spreading fast. Jake didn't think. He emptied the extinguisher on the passenger side, creating a brief window through the flames. The metal door frame was already buckling from the heat, but he wedged his tire iron into the gap and pulled with every ounce of strength he possessed. The door gave way with a screech of metal, and he dove into the smoke-filled interior. His lungs burned, his eyes watered, but his hands found the first car seat buckle and released it, pulling the screaming child against his chest before stumbling back out. "Take her," he shouted to a truck driver who'd stopped to help, shoving the little girl into the man's arms. "Call 911, then he went back in. The heat was unbearable now. The whole rear end of the SUV was engulfed, and Jake could feel his shirt beginning to singe. But he could see the second child, her tiny arms reaching for him through the smoke. He grabbed her car seat, fighting with the buckle as flames licked at his hands. Finally, it released, and he pulled her free just as something exploded in the engine compartment. The force threw him backward onto the asphalt, the child clutched against him as a fireball erupted from under the hood. When Jake came to, paramedics were loading the two little girls into an ambulance. Their mother was being extracted from the front seat by firefighters with the jaws of life. Someone had wrapped a blanket around Jake's shoulders, and he realized his hands were covered in burns and cuts. A young EMT was trying to look at his injuries, but Jake pushed him away. "Are they alive?" His voice was hoarse from the smoke. "The girls, are they?" "Thanks to you, sir," the EMT said quietly. "You saved their lives." Jake watched the ambulance pull away. Sirens wailing into the twilight. Only then did he allow his legs to give out, sinking onto the back bumper of a fire truck. He'd done what anyone would do, he told himself. What anyone should do. He didn't want thanks or recognition. He just wanted to go home, tend to his burns, and maybe have a stiff drink before bed. The next morning, Jake woke to a sound he'd never heard on his property before, the rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors. Not just one, multiple. He stumbled to his bedroom window in his undershirt and jeans, squinting against the morning sun, and his jaw dropped. 3 helicopters were descending into his fields, their downdraft flattening the tall grass in wide circles. Behind them, a convoy of black SUVs was making its way up his long dirt driveway. "What in the hell?" Jake muttered, pulling on his boots and heading outside. The first person to emerge from the lead helicopter was a woman in an elegant navy suit, her dark hair pulled back severely. She was flanked by Secret Service agents. Jake recognized the earpieces and stern expressions immediately. But it was the second helicopter that made his heart stop. A man in his late 40s stepped out, followed by those 2 little girls from the crash, each holding his hands. Behind them came their mother, her head bandaged but her eyes bright with tears. "Mr. Morrison. The woman in the navy suit approached him first, extending her hand. I'm Rebecca Chen, Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Harrison. May we have a moment of your time? Jake shook her hand numbly, his mind racing. Secretary of State. The Secretary of State, which meant the man walking toward him, those two little girls skipping beside him, was Jake Morrison, Secretary Marcus Harrison said, his voice warm despite the formality of the situation. These are my daughters, Sophie and Sarah. And this is my wife, Jennifer. I believe you've already met. The woman from the crashed car stepped forward, and Jake finally recognized her without the blood and terror on her face. He'd seen her on the news 100 times, always standing beside her husband at international summits and diplomatic events. Mr. Morrison, Jennifer Harrison said, her voice breaking. You saved my babies. When our car was hit by that drunk driver, when I couldn't reach them and the fire started, you ran into those flames without hesitation. Jake looked down at the two little girls staring up at him with wide brown eyes. Sophie, or was it Sarah, stepped forward and wrapped her small arms around his leg. You're the hero, man, she said solemnly. Daddy said you're a real hero. Something cracked in Jake's chest. He knelt down, wincing slightly from his bandaged hands, and met the girls at eye level. Your mom is the hero, he said softly. She stayed calm and kept you safe until help could come. I just did what anyone would do. That's where you're wrong, Secretary Harrison said, crouching beside them. Most people would have been too afraid. Most people would have waited for the fire department. You risked your life for strangers, and because of that, I still have my family. His voice grew thick with emotion. How does a man even begin to repay that debt? Jake stood slowly, shaking his head. You don't owe me anything, sir. I'm just glad they're okay. What happened next took hours. The Harrisons wouldn't leave until they'd heard Jake's whole story, his garage, his simple life, his late parents' farm. When Jennifer learned that Jake had always wanted to expand his garage to offer free repairs to struggling families but never had the means, she and Marcus exchanged a long look. We can't force you to accept help, Marcus Harrison said finally. But our family has resources, and we have influence. If you'd allow it, we'd like to establish a foundation in your name. The Morrison Community Fund. It would support the kind of work you want to do, helping people who can't afford to help themselves. Jake tried to refuse. He argued that he didn't need recognition, didn't want attention. But when little Sophie tugged on his hand and said, please, so you can help more people like you helped us, he felt his resistance crumble. By the time the helicopters lifted off that afternoon, Jake had agreed to let the Harrisons set up the foundation. Within weeks, his story had spread across the country, not because he sought fame, but because in a world hungry for genuine heroism, people needed to know that ordinary men still did extraordinary things. The Morrison Community Fund eventually grew beyond anyone's expectations, funding free automotive repairs, trades education, and emergency assistance programs in small towns across America. But Jake never moved from his farm or changed his simple ways. He still fixed engines in his garage, still lived alone, still drove that old pickup truck. The difference was that now, every single day, he received letters from people thanking him. Not just for saving two little girls from a burning car, but for reminding an entire nation that courage doesn't wear a uniform or carry a badge. Sometimes it just wears grease-stained coveralls and drives down a highway at exactly the right moment. And every year on the anniversary of that terrible, wonderful day, two little girls and their parents came to visit Jake on his Nebraska farm, bringing homemade pie and gratitude that would last a lifetime.